ever wondered why a certain person you knew ended up as a failure in life? And when you think back to the beginning of this early life, like at the early part, well, it seemed like everything was going well. So now at the end, it's like kind of a surprise at the failure. Well, one person in the Bible, one such person is Lot. He started out with promise, but ended up losing it all. Now, Lot is not often talked about. He's Abraham's nephew, and he kind of just follows Abraham around wherever he goes. But as I studied about Abraham and Lot, I began to wonder why. Why he went from Abraham's altar to a cave dwelling. What choices led him down that path? So we're going to start looking in Genesis 13. Genesis chapter 13, although Lot is mentioned earlier, this is where we'll start. Genesis 13. Now you have to grab your Bibles because I have nothing coming up on the screen. Genesis chapter 13. Starting in verse 1. Then Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Now Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar that which he had made there at first. And there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. Lot also went with Abraham. He had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites then also dwelt in the land. So Abraham said to Lot, "Please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. And if you take the left, well, then I'll go to the right. And if you take the right, well, then I'll go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he looked. And he saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed it. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Now in verses 13:1, we see Lot following Abraham. Wherever Abraham goes, Lot goes. So what has Lot learned from Abraham? Well, in broad terms, he has watched Abraham compromise. It was Abraham that got the call from God to leave Ur and his family, yet it is his father Terah that takes the family out of Ur. And nor does Abraham move on until his father is dead. So he has compromised his call. And in the verses we just read, they have just come back from Egypt, where he watched Abraham compromise his faith and his marriage by lying to Pharaoh. Well, Lot does not seem to learn much from Abraham's mistakes. On the positive side, though, Lot has learned a strong sense of morality. He has learned of the true God and never does sink into idolatry. He has also learned how to be successful with flocks and herds, for he is now wealthy enough to be the cause of trouble between their herdsmen. Now Lot would have remembered the fertile land of Ur that he left when he followed his grandfather out of Ur, but fresher in his mind was the memory of the fertile land of Egypt he had just come from. Why stay where the pastures are sparse and one has to fight for the best part? So in verse 10, Lot saw. He saw what looked like the garden of the Lord, a plain that was well watered everywhere. And next in verse 11, Lot did two actions. He chose, which led to his journeying east. And this resulted in a permanent separation between himself and Abraham. But what Lot saw was the potential for material gain and wealth. Well, maybe Lot was tired of being under Abraham's authority. Maybe he wanted to be the head of a family. In any case, when the opportunity came, his selfish nature sprang into action, and he put himself ahead of everyone else. Reading from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 133. Can you hear me if I'm over here? Lot manifested no gratitude to his benefactor. Courtesy would have dictated that he yielded the choice to Abraham. But instead of this, he selfishly endeavored to grasp all of its advantages. He lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. Dazzled by visions of worldly gain, Lot overlooked the moral and spiritual evils that would be encountered there. The inhabitants of the plain were sinners before the Lord exceedingly, but of this he was ignorant, or knowing, gave it but little thought. He chose him all the plain of Jordan, and he pitched his tent towards Sodom. How little did he foresee the terrible results of that selfish choice. End of quote. Now in the reference, twice it mentions Lot's selfishness. 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, kind of explains what happened in Lot's heart. For it says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. There is room for only self or God in one's heart, and Lot's heart was largely bound up with his love for material things, so there wasn't really much room left for the love of the Father. Now the problem was that it was Abraham's altar that he walked away from, and not his own. In fact, there is no mention of Lot ever having his own altar. And for sure he would not have had one in the city of Sodom, for cities had their own central altars. Later Bible writers such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Jude refer to Sodom as an example of gross sin. Now I'm not going to read all of these, but I'm going to pick the one in Ezekiel. It's on chapter 16. Ezekiel 16, verses 49. Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore, I took them away as I saw fit. In 4 Testimonies, page 156, it says, there is nothing more desired among men than riches and leisure. And yet these gave birth to the sins that brought destruction upon the cities of the plain. Their useless, idle life made them a prey to Satan's temptations, and they defaced the image of God and became satanic rather than divine. Idleness is the greatest curse that can fall upon man, for vice and crime follow in its train. It enfeebles the mind, perverts the understanding, and debases the soul. End of quote. The next chapter in the story of Lot is recorded in Genesis 14. It's between verses 1 and 6. In verse 12, it tells us that by now Lot has given up his tent and moved into the city of Sodom. Now, there is no record of how long he lived on the plain before moving into Sodom, nor of how long he was in the city of Sodom when this part of the story takes place. The fact is, he is there. Another fact is that the 5 cities of the plain were in confederation with each other, and as a group were under the suzerainty of a powerful king named Kedorlaomer. Verse 4 tells us that these 5 cities had paid tribute to Kedorlaomer for 12 years, and in the 13th year they rebelled. Now, this caused Kedorlaomer and his confederates to attack these cities on the plain to retrieve the tribute. Now, Lot may have moved into Sodom before the taxation for tribute started, or he may have moved in knowing that as a resident of Sodom, he would now be responsible for his part of the portion for the tribute. In either case, his original decision, based on materialistic goal of wealth, is now being eroded by these taxes. He could have easily moved out of the valley, away from the cities, and avoided the taxes if he was still living in his tent. Yeah, and these taxes, they should have been a warning sign to Lot of the dangers of living in Sodom. But yet again, Lot fails to see things from a spiritual perspective. So look at Genesis 14:4 again. It says, in the 13th year they rebelled. Then there was a year of false security, for in the 14th year, Kedorlaomer showed up. Now, what Lot failed to recognize was that while Sodom and the surrounding cities had thrown off the suzerain rule of Kedorlaomer, they had, more importantly, long ago, thrown off all homage to God. Genesis 14, verses 5 to 7, describes Kedorlaomer's war strategy. Now, instead of reading these verses when we don't understand where these places are, I'm going to let John Butler, in his book called Lot the Worldly Christian, explain it. The 4 kings came down from the north and smote the cities and tribes on the east side of the 5 cities. Then they continued in a circle, smiting others to the south and to the west of the cities. After all this was done, they engaged the 5 cities in war in the Vale of Siddim. End of quote. Smart strategy for war. I think it's also smart strategy for overcoming sin. Remove all obstacles to success. Now, maybe it's a bit surprising how completely the 5 cities of the Vale were defeated by the 4 attacking kings. Well, maybe not surprising if one reads again Ezekiel. It says, look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. Now, that description is not that of a well-trained army. A city that is noted for having an abundance of idleness likely does not have well-trained and honed soldiers. Checking verse 12, 14 verse 12, we note that Lot now starts the process of losing. In all, he will lose 5 P's. Peace, protection, power, possessions, and pleasures. The first is peace. Well, no one in the Vale could have had peace while knowing Kedorlaomer's army was coming, particularly as the cities and tribes that encircled them were defeated. There was the danger to himself, his family, and to all his accumulated wealth. Their armies, if they had any in reserve at all, were used to partying and not fighting. Thus, he did not have protection. And with no effective protection, Lot himself was powerless to avoid capture of himself, his family, or his possessions. All he had gained materially was now at risk of capture. He would have watched the invading army loot his place along with everyone else's. So now he had no possessions. Well, which is a whole lot less than what he had when he lived in his tent. In the last P, he lost his pleasure. There is certainly no pleasure in being a captive on a prisoner of war march. He did gain a new P, though, pain. He lost 5 P's, and I can think of 5 P's of pain that he did gain. The first would be physical pain. He and all the rest were, Ezekiel puts it, fullness of food and abundance of idleness. Well, I call that fat and lazy. Yep, in that state, physical pain was guaranteed on a war march. Secondly, emotional pain was also guaranteed. There was the anguish of seeing your family suffer, to say nothing about the fact that the suffering came as a result of your own choices. Third, there would have been the pain of injustice as he watched in indignation someone else gloating over the possession of his stuff. And how about the mental torment of the what-ifs? What if I had never left Abraham? Well, what if I had even just gone the other direction? Well, what if I had just stayed in my tent? And what if I had made spiritual things more important? The fifth pain came in the form of experiencing degradation from the treatment and taunts of the captors. Now, it was on account of Abraham's great love for Lot that he, in grace, did not leave Lot to get what he deserved, but pursued the war march to rescue and restore. In Genesis 14:15, it says that Abraham pursued the 4 kings and their armies as far as Hobah. Well, this piece of geographical information tells us that he went an additional 120 miles farther than the initial rescue. For Abraham's 318 trained soldiers to accomplish such a complete defeat and rescue against the 4-king combined army is not really humanly realistic. This kind of victory God later spoke of in Leviticus, chapters 26 and verse 8. You might want to look this one up rather than just listening to me talk about it. Leviticus 26 and verse 8. It says, 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000 to flight. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you. Could it be that God was referring to this story when he spoke these words to Moses in Leviticus as an example of how he would fulfill this promise? In fact, Melchizedek speaks to this in Genesis 14 in verses 18 to 20. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of the God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham, God of Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. Now in verse 21, we hear the king of Sodom offering Abraham all the goods. This would, of course, included Lot's stuff. To watch someone else offering your stuff to Abraham probably didn't sit well with Lot. Now, some 15 or more years pass between chapters 14 and chapter 19, where we next find Lot. Sodom has sunk farther into debauchery. Lot has now adult daughters, some of whom are married. And in verse 22, 18:22, we have to back up a verse, we note that the two angels who visit Abraham and Sarah with the Lord turned away from there and went to Sodom. And in 19:1, these two angels arrive in Sodom. The Lord stayed with Abraham. The two angels arrived alone. Lot was sitting at the gate. The gate of the city was where the who's who of the city would hang out. Lot was among these. Now it was now evening, so no more business or legal matters would have been conducted. Now we see this practice throughout the Old Testament, and a good example is Ruth 4:1, where Boaz went up to the gate and sat there. And according to Patriarchs and Prophets, page 158, Lot had a different reason for being there. But there was one man who manifested kindly attention toward the strangers and invited them to his home. Lot did not know their true character, but politeness and hospitality were habitual with him. They were part of his religion, lessons he had learned from Abraham. Seeing the abuse to which strangers were exposed in Sodom, Lot made it one of his duties to guard them at the entrance by offering them entertainment at his own house. So he was sitting at the gate as the travelers approached, and upon observing them, he arose from his place to meet them, and bowing courteously, said, "Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night." They seemed to decline his hospitality, saying, "Nah, but we will stay in the street." The object of their answer was twofold: to test the sincerity of Lot, and also to appear ignorant of the character of the men of Sodom, as if they supposed it was safe to stay in the street at night. Their answer made Lot more determined not to leave them to the mercy of the rabble, and he pressed his invitation until they yielded and accompanied them to his house. End of quote. Now, the delay of the angels to accept Lot's invitation drew the crowd's attention to them. Lot had the angels in his house only long enough to eat before the lustful mob arrived. Lot's mild reproof only inflamed that gang more. And here we see the effects of the familiarity of sin on Lot. He had no passion for denouncing sin. In Genesis 19:8, Lot offers his two virgin daughters to the mob. There is a similar story in Judges 19, verses 22 to 28. And the wording in this story in Judges is eerily similar to the one involving Lot. In this story, the girl was in fact delivered to be abused to death. In both stories, the men, including Lot, were acting according to Eastern culture, protecting their guests at the cost of family members. Well, regardless of the culture's requirements, Lot's thinking was seriously messed up by his dwelling in Sodom. He had become very desensitized about the wickedness of Sodom. And one can never win against sin by using evil to fight evil. Lot no longer understood the true meaning of sacrifice. John Butler in his book says it this way, quote, "He sacrificed what he should have held on to tenaciously, his daughter's virtue, but he held on tenaciously to what he should have dropped like a hot potato, friendship with homosexuals. When we walk contrary to God, we will sacrifice character for reputation, purity for popularity and position, the spiritual for the material, and eternal things for temporal things." End of quote. Now down in verse 12, Lot is commissioned to get his family out of the city. And Lot's next actions are to be commended, actually. His obedience was immediate. No doubt he was shook up enough from his angelic deliverance to not question the warning of judgment. He demonstrated courage to go out into those dark streets where the mob may have still been lingering. He was also faithful in delivering a true, unwatered-down message. However, none were interested in leaving. Now, the reasons for his utter failure to convince them of the coming destruction started earlier on in his life. First of all, Lot lived as one of them, so his message did not match his worldly lifestyle. 2, there was an apparent lack of spiritual training in the home as the children grew up because none of his family showed any interest in God and righteousness. And thirdly, indeed, the sons-in-law scoffed at him. Again, lifestyle matters. The sons-in-law had lived a life of heart-hardening sin, and as a result, could not discern spiritual things. I'm going to read again from Patriarchs and Prophets on page 160. Lot returned sorrowfully to his home and told the story of his failure. Then the angels bade him arise and take his wife and the 2 daughters who were yet in his house and leave the city. But Lot delayed. Though daily distressed at beholding deeds of violence, he had no true conception of the debasing and abominable iniquity practiced in that vile city. He did not realize the terrible necessity for God's judgments to put a check on sin. And some of his children clung to Sodom, and his wife refused to depart without them. The thought of leaving those he held dearest on earth seemed more than he could bear. It was hard to forsake his luxurious home and all the wealth acquired by the labors of his whole life, to go forth a destitute wanderer. Stupefied with sorrow, he lingered, loath to depart. But for the angels of God, they would all have perished in the ruin of Sodom. The heavenly messengers took him by the hand and led him out of the city. And of quoted in 4 Testimonies, page 111, it says that Lot was paralyzed by the great calamity about to occur. He was stupefied with grief at the thought of leaving all he held dear on earth. John Butler says it this way: Lot did not reject the message of fleeing Sodom in the same way the sons-in-law did. They laughed and scorned and belittled. Lot simply delayed. But the result is the same. Rejection of God's message can be done with vehement outward scorn, or it can be done with quiet indifference. But either way, it accomplishes the same thing. It greatly imperils the souls of men. End of quote. Desensitized by sin, and in spite of the angels in front of him, Lot puts both his family and his wealth ahead of God. We will leave Lot in the angel's hands for now. He is at a point of failure already, even if he's not yet in the cave. But let's turn to James. James chapter 1. James chapter 1. I'm going to read verses 14 and 15. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. In these verses, we see the life of Lot. He desired the plain of Jordan. His desire increased until he became enticed. And that enticement grew until Lot conceived a plan. And that plan took shape in his mind, and in time gave birth to the sins of ingratitude selfishness, and the greed that led him to moving into the plain of Jordan. And there, in the plain of Jordan, the surrounding evils enfeebled his mind and destroyed his spiritual understanding. And there in the plain was death. Now, even though we've looked at the path of Lot's life, my original why question remains. I haven't discovered it yet. And here's where I was surprised. Not only did the answer surprise me, but also at the many times God confirmed that answer during the time I was doing this study. So I'm going to go back and read the beginning part of the quote in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 133. Lot manifested no gratitude to his benefactor. Courtesy would have dictated that he yielded the choice to Abraham, but instead of this, he selfishly endeavored to grasp all its advantages. So let's follow Lot again and look for this ingratitude. Back at Genesis chapter 13 and verse 11. Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. It is in this verse that we see the first fruit of his ingratitude. He discourteously chose for himself. His drive to put self first is displayed in his lack of courtesy and respect in not deferring to Abraham. But his lack of courtesy is only the outward expression of the bigger issue of his lack of gratitude towards Abraham. The next clue is in Genesis 14 and verse 16, where we see Lot and his stuff rescued by Abraham. In verse 17 and 21, we see the king of Sodom gratefully offering Abraham the recovered goods, which of course was including Lot's stuff. But who we do not see is Lot. It's as if he has disappeared, for he is certainly not expressing gratitude. He simply takes up life back in Sodom as if nothing had happened. Well, no lessons learned here either. Now look at chapter 19, and verses 10 and 11. It's here that the angels save Lot's life and that of his two daughters from the lustful mob. There's no mention of a simple thank you to the angels. Nor does Lot even seem thankful for the warning to flee for his life, for in verse 16, he lingers. According to Patriarchs and Prophets, page 160, after warning Lot to flee to the mountain, the two angels, quote, left them and turned back to Sodom to accomplish their work of destruction. Another, he with whom Abraham had pleaded, drew near to Lot. Yahweh himself is now at Lot's side. Abraham had recognized him and worshipped him. Lot only does not recognize him, but increases his sin. And in 1919, Lot basically accused, to his face, the God he claimed to worship of being unable to save him from the coming destruction, and that therefore obedience was not only impossible, but actually harmful and deadly. Instead of praying, "Thy will be done, not mine," Lot prayed, "My will be done, not yours." His pathetic, insulting whining proves how far his ingratitude had degraded him. In fact, his lingering and complaining had caused his wife to turn and take that fateful look. And Yahweh's response to this gross ingratitude was yet more mercy, as revealed in verses 21 to 24, where he limits the extent of the destruction so Lot can stay in the plain. Oh, the magnitude of the love and grace of God in his constant pursuit of us. And then there is the cave that Lot eventually ended up in. Now, I've contemplated what kept Lot in that cave. After all, Abraham is not far away. Here again, I think the key is in gratitude. A heart that is practiced in gratitude for a lifetime is going to struggle with repentance, and particularly humility. And there is no way Lot can approach Abraham without either. So he stays in the cave and fathers two nations that becomes Israel's bitterest enemies. So here is what surprised me. It is not, as I had originally thought, the path of sin Lot followed that drove him to failure. Instead, it all started while he was worshiping at Abraham's altar. And ingratitude is the key. Here is the why, that starting point of journeying into a failed life, an ungrateful heart that puts self first. This lack of gratitude caused him to fight for the best part of the pasture. It is this same lack of gratitude that burst into life as he disrespected Abraham and propelled him to choose that well-watered vale and the city of Sodom. This determined the rest of his life. This put him in a cave and kept him there. So let's pause for a moment and ask, what is gratitude? According to the website Very Well Mind, gratitude is defined as a positive emotion that involves being thankful and appreciative, and that you will respond with feelings of warmth and kindness and generosity. Well, that sounds kind of nice, but is it really necessary or important? Well, God considers ingratitude a sin. For in Numbers 21, verses 5 and 6, the Israelites complained against God, so he withdrew his protection from the camp, and fiery serpents bit the people. Mrs. White says in Volume 4A of Spiritual Gifts, on page 41, that, to quote, "This is to punish them for their ingratitude and complaining against God." So, where do we find ourselves today? That's the all-important question. Where are we? Have our hearts become hardened into dysfunction by the arrogance of pride? Have our hearts been encrusted over with bitterness, anger, resentment, and jealousy, making it impossible for the love of God to penetrate? Has carelessness insidiously frozen our hearts into indifference so that we no longer even want to hear of God's great love? Have our hearts become enshrouded by the darkness of doubts and discouragements? Has sin enfeebled our mind, perverted our understanding, and debased our very souls? Have our hearts become calloused by the lax morality of society? And have we cloaked our hearts with that hypocritical lie that religious activity equals heart religion? In 4 Testimonies, page 109, it says, "Few realize their own weakness, and that the natural sinfulness of the human heart too often paralyzes their noblest endeavors." Now listen to 5 Testimonies, page 72, talking of Christ. It says, "The tears which Christ shed on the crest of Olivet were for the impenitence and ingratitude of every individual to the close of time." That's us. He sees his love despised. The soul's temple courts have been converted into places of unholy traffic. Selfishness, mammon, malice, envy, pride, and passion are all cherished in the human heart. In Desire of Ages 3:4-7, Jesus constantly delivers us from peril, yet we are unimpressed. Jesus has given all the riches of heaven to redeem us, and yet we are unmindful of his great love. By our ingratitude, we close our hearts against the grace of God. That's a scary thing. Let me read it again. By our ingratitude, we close our hearts against the grace of God. End of quote. Listen to Jesus in Luke 21. Luke 21, verses 34-36. It says, "Take heed to yourself, lest your heart be weighed down with carousing and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch, therefore, and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man." 2 Corinthians 13:5. Here Paul says, "Examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you are disqualified." We need to check our hearts to see where we are personally on what I call the thermometer of gratitude. What do you see in the mirror? Do you see a happy face bubbling over with joyful gratitude for all that Christ has accomplished? Or do you see that sad and despairing face because your heart has grown cold and hard? Are you facing a foreboding, cold, dark, and barren cave of ingratitude? Leave Lot behind. Turn and run for your spiritual life. There is a path of escape. The starting point to this path is gratitude. So to decide today to start practicing the expressing of gratitude to God for his great goodness and mercy towards us. Express it loudly and express it with joy. It's not really enough to just quietly live a godly life. We need to say and hear the words. Ministry of Healing says this: "No tongue can express, no finite mind can even conceive the blessings that result from appreciating the goodness and love of God. And even on earth we may have joy as a wellspring, never failing, because it is fed by the streams that flow from the throne of God." I'm going to read that one again. No tongue can express, and no finite mind can even conceive the blessings that result from expressing gratitude for the goodness and love of God. Even on earth, we may have joy as a wellspring, never failing, because it is fed by the streams that flow from the throne of God. Do you want this wellspring of joy? If so, stand with me and sing this prayer. Hymn 334. On the fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me ever to adore thee, may I still thy goodness prove, while the hope of endless glory fills my heart with joy and love. Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, he to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind me closer still to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. Amen.